The night was cold and wet, but in a small parlour of this villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. A father and son were at chess. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said Herbert, his son, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he will come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Checkmate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. The paths are all filthy. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are rented, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you win the next game." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. "There he is," said Herbert White as the gate banged too loudly and heavy footsteps came towards the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard embracing with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Toot toot," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing himself. The Sergeant Major took hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly as his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk. The little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange people. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He doesn't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I would like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the Sergeant Major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "At least, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the Sergeant Major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him again. "To look at," said the Sergeant Major, fumbling in his pocket. "It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there so special about it?" inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son and, having examined it, placed it upon the table. "He had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the Sergeant Major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manners were so impressive that his listeners were conscious that their light laughter had faded somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the Sergeant Major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes." Yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first two were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I just don't know. He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I have warned you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward, the 3 sat listening to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert as the door closed behind their guest just in time to catch the last train, we shall not make so much out of it. Did you give anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said he, colouring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Lightly, said Herbert with pretended horror. Why, we are going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with, then you can't be argued with. He darted around the table, pursued by the malign Mrs. White. Mr. White then took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me that I've got all I've ever wanted. If you only cleared the house, you'll be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert with his hand on his shoulders. Well, wish for £200, then that will just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted his words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him. It moved, he cried with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. It must have been your imagination then, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their smokes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, as the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. An unusual silence settled on all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the rest of the night. I expect you find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten grains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire, and seeing faces in it. The last was so horrible that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, He fell on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and then went up to bed. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of wholesomeness about the room which he had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard so carelessly, indication of their lack of belief in their virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense! How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. "Maurice said the things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it will turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's naivety, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of alcoholism when she found out that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "I dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I will swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I had just—" "What is the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside who, peering indecisively into the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In her mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat. 3 times he paused at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then, with sudden resolution, flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her, hurriedly unfastened the strings of her apron, and put the monkey's paw beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her curiously and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited patiently for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from the factory." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interrupted. "Relax there," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir," and eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother frantically. The visitor bowed in grief. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old lady, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. Thank—" She broke off as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned on her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath and, turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling hand on his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. "Yes," he said, staring out the window, and took his wife's hand between his own. "He was our only child," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed and, standing up, walked slowly towards the window. "The firm wishes me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your time of great loss," he said, without looking around. "I beg that you will understand that I am only their servant and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look of pure grief. "I was to say that the company was not claiming any responsibility," continued the other. "They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. "How much?" £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly and dropped senselessly to the floor. In the huge cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their son and came back to the house steeped in shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen, something else which could lighten this load, which was simply too heavy for the old couple to bear. But the days passed, and expectations gave way to resignation, the hopeless resignation of apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long and dreary. It was about a week after that the old man, waking up suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and continued to cry. The sounds of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He began to nod off and began drifting off to sleep until a sudden loud cry from his wife startled him back to consciousness. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it, have you?" "It's in the cupboard, on the bracket," he replied. "What's the matter?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was that not enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again." The man sat in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "My dear, you are crazy," he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh please will you just wish?" Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you are saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "It's just a coincidence," said the old man. "Go get it and wish," cried his wife, shaking with excitement. The old man turned to look at her, and his voice shook. He has been dead now for 10 days. If he was too terrible for you to see back then, isn't it even worse now? Bring him back, cried the old woman, and dragged him towards the door. Do you think I fear the child I have raised with my bare hands? He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the living room, and then to the fireplace. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before he could escape from the room, seized up on him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in a small passageway with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed to have changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears, seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "This is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son to be alive again." The talisman fell to the floor and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was completely chilled by the unforgiving cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was casting pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until it expired with a flicker larger than the rest. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute afterward, the old woman came silently beside him. Neither of them spoke, but they both sat silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time gathering up his courage, he took the box of matches and after striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock came so quietly and stealthily that it was barely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passageway. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What is that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resonated through the house. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her and, catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What do you think you are going to do?" he whispered. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling frantically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away." "What on earth are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door." "For God's sake, do not let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." There was another knock, and then another. The old woman, with a sudden burst of strength, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed her to the landing and called after her as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bolt drawn slowly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt!" she cried loudly. "Come down, please. I cannot reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. A series of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same time, he found the monkey's paw and he frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back, and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp, flickering opposite, shone on a quiet and deserted road.